This is the You Can Learn Chinese podcast, part of the Seneca Network from the China Project. For everyone who's trying to learn Chinese or reaching for the next level, you came to the right place. I'm your host, Jared Turner, co-founder of the Mandarin Companion Graded Reader Series, longtime resident of China. And before you marry a person, I think you should first make them use a computer with slow internet, just to see what they're really like. My co-host is John Pasden, co-founder of Mandarin Companion, founder of All Set Learning, the Chinese Grammar Wiki, Sinosplice.com, and recently posed the question, is pi a round number? China has lifted COVID restrictions and is issuing visas. It's time to visit China. John and I talk about what you need to know about visiting China that has opened back up. Guest interview is with Sophia Xavier from Portugal, whose fascination with China led her to study in China and pursue career opportunities in Southeast Asia. Let's get to it. Hey guys, this is Jared Turner coming to you from Utah in the United States.
Hi everybody, my name is John Pasden. I am in Shanghai, China, and I'd like to apologize right up front. I have a little bit of a cold, but I'm going to keep on trucking.
Never let that stop us.
Yeah, it just crept up on me literally hours before recording, but yeah, I'll be all right.
All right, Jiao, hang in there, man. Well, hey, good news, John. It looks like we can come back to China.
Yeah, so that's the big news everyone in Shanghai has been talking about recently. Finally, there's no more restrictions on tourist visas and even COVID tests. Is that right?
That's right. That's right. The latest news released yesterday. So we're going to dive into this, and it's a great time now to go back to China, book that flight. Well, make sure your visa first. We'll talk about this, and we're going to talk about things that you should prepare, things you should know, and some tips if you want to make a visit to China.
And of course you want to make a visit to China. Come on. Like, what have you been learning Chinese for all this time? Why have you been listening to this podcast?
Definitely. And John, I miss China. It's been 3 years, man. Over 3 years. It's been my longest hiatus ever being away from China since I first came.
Well, you should stop by, man.
I'll do it, and we'll give each other a hug. Okay, well, first thing you should know is about getting your Chinese visa. So what you need to apply for is a tourist visa. So it's called an L visa. I'm just going to run through this really quick. You can go onto your local China embassy website, and you could find the information. But basically, here's what you need to have. So you got to have your existing passport. It needs to have at least 6 months on it. So remember, if it's going to expire soon, go get a new passport. They want a copy of the actual passport. And the thing now is they used to have this visa form that you'd fill out and send in, but instead they moved it online. And in that form, you're going to be like telling them all about your stuff, your family, your work experience, your life, your preference, your favorite color. Not really. But you need to go fill that online. If you've had a visa in the past, they're going to want a copy of that, even if that visa was in your old passport. Oh, and P.S., if you have a visa in your old passport, and even if it's all expired, make sure you bring it with you. That's just a pro tip. I've ran into issues before. So make sure you have all your old stuff with you as well when you travel.
Wait a minute. Are you saying they won't give you a new visa if they don't see your old visa, or it'll just help you get a new visa, or what?
I don't know. That's a good question. It's just that they say they require that if you do have an old visa. Even if you have an old Chinese residence permit, you need to make sure you bring that passport and that, obviously, that document's in your passport. But make sure you also submit a copy of it when you're applying for your visa.
All right, that's kind of weird, but I'm sure it's just to give you a VIP visa.
Oh, absolutely, I'm sure. But they require other things too. It's just like there's a proof of residence, making sure you actually live where you say you live. Now, one of the things that gets confusing a little bit to people is they require a kind of verification that you're actually traveling to China. And so you need one of two things. You need to show like tickets that you've already booked and hotel stay, like where you're going to live when you're there in China or just stay in China. Now, this can be a little bit like difficult to book ahead. Like sometimes you need 2 months out or whatever, and maybe you haven't booked all that stuff. So the other thing you can have is a letter of invitation, and that can be issued by, they say, a relevant entity, which is like a travel agency or somebody in China. There's actually like a form for this, or there's like templates that you can use, and you can just Google that and look it up. You can find something that you need. If you have a Chinese friend, they can help fill that out, so you may not have to book everything ahead of time. So anyway, so that's what you need for the Chinese visa. You don't have to go through an agency. You can do it all yourself nowadays on the Chinese embassy website and mailing things in. But that's just a couple things you should know before you go.
And COVID testing?
Well, good news. According to my most trustworthy and expert advisors on Reddit, they say that yesterday they have dropped all COVID requirements to enter China. So apparently you don't need to have a test or proof of vaccination to enter China. The interesting caveat is that some countries may require tests or vaccination to get on the plane. So make sure you check what any regulations might be in your own country, but it looks like most things are going to be lifting. And if not lifted, are going to be lifting pretty soon.
All right, so enough of that. Let's get on to the interesting part, the linguistic considerations if you're planning a trip to China. Now, I know that, when you're planning a trip, some things end up being last minute. You're throwing stuff into the suitcase and trying to make sure you don't forget anything. But hopefully your Chinese language studies are not one of those.
That's right. And if you're like me, you've been away from China for a long time, it's time to polish those up and get ready for the trip.
Right, but since you've been away from China for a long time, maybe you've gotten used to studying Chinese with this, uncertainty about when you're ever going back to China. You might not be ready for the reality of China. Maybe you've been studying HSK or some literature or something, some awesome Mandarin Companion books, which are good, but are you ready to hit the ground? Are you ready to buy food and eat it in China? Are you ready for all this super practical stuff? That's what we want to talk about.
That's right. So it's time to start really digging into this.
All right, so first of all, let's talk about food. If you have any allergies, obviously you need to know how to make those known. So make sure you make notes on that. Or if you have foods you hate, for example, I hate cilantro, that vile weed.
What's wrong with you, John?
I hate it.
John, are you one of those people? There's like 10% of people where it tastes like soap.
I hate it.
Because it's like genetics or something? No. That's a birth defect. That's
actually, I can stand it in some Mexican dishes like ceviche, but I don't like it in Chinese food. Don't like it in my beef noodles. Anyway, whatever you don't like or whatever you're allergic to, obviously you should be taking notes on this. You need to be able to say it. You need to practice those tones. You need to know the vocabulary. And maybe there's some foods you do like and you don't want to forget to eat while you're in China. Make notes on those too.
And I will say something is that if this is your first time going to China and you expect the Chinese food to be the same as the Chinese food at the restaurant, down the street from you, prepare to be disappointed. So you may actually need to do a little research into this and find out, oh, wait a second, there was a lot more to Chinese cuisine than maybe lemon chicken, which they don't really have in China. I've had it, but
well, I should say you will not be disappointed. You will be amazed and delighted.
That's correct.
You won't like everything, but there'll be plenty of stuff you'll enjoy. That's for sure.
And if you are like, if you need gluten-free, if you're celiac or something like that, there are a lot of options there. But you also got to be careful, right? Because even like soy sauce, that actually has gluten in it. I've had a friend in China who was celiac, and you did actually have to be kind of careful. So you do need to watch out for some of that stuff and do a little more research, because I know it's difficult for celiacs to travel. You can't just get up and go, right? Got to do research and plan out that thing so you don't end up sick the whole time.
Yeah, and if you're a beginner, you might want to write this stuff down, get a Chinese friend or, print it out or something to make absolute sure you can communicate very clearly what you can and can't eat.
That's right, and even having a phrase, a sentence that you can, communicate. I've even seen someone before. I had my friend who I was mentioning. She's celiac there in China. She actually had it on a card or something. She could actually just be really clear and show it. I mean, she was able to speak Chinese okay, but she wanted to make sure she had no issues and people understood what her situation was. So those are some things you could do. But John, you were totally right. If you won't be disappointed coming to China and finding the food. One of the things I actually love is the immense amount of diversity of food in China. It's so wonderful. I mean, you got stuff out from Xinjiang, which is actually one of my favorite foods, and you got the food from the south, and then from the north, and you got the center. Anyway, it's just there's so much food out there, a variety, and it's such great stuff. I love it.
All right, do keep in mind though that some foods are more common in certain parts of China. So if you're a big fan of a certain food, maybe a Sichuan food or something, but you're not in that area, it might not be super easy to find. So got to be a little bit flexible too. All right, so let's go on to the next topic, and that is lodging. So, you've probably booked your hotel or whatever, but one thing that trips people up sometimes is they only know the English. And when they arrive in China, no one knows the English, and then it can be a bit confusing for a while.
Oh yes, this is a big deal. In fact, I think when you're talking preparing for any of your trips to China, and this is wherever you're going or wherever, make sure you're using resources that also will include the Chinese characters or Chinese address of locations. I mean, for example, like sometimes I know there's this tourist spot in Suzhou. I'm trying to remember the name. It's like Tiger Hill or something. And I remember once trying to go to it, and then I actually had, and I spoke Chinese at the time, and I actually had no idea what the name was in Chinese. Well, that isn't going to get you very far. And oftentimes, even if someone does speak English and you're just using only the English name, they may not know the translated English name of that location. And so, making sure that you actually have the characters of a destination are really important.
Yeah, and if you know the Chinese name of your hotel, then you can get help a lot more easily. If you only know the English name, it might just be that the one person that knows the English name is the person that's trying to scam you, trying to give you that overpriced ride or whatever. So often you can ask the hotel in advance by email or whatever, and they'll give you the Chinese. But if you don't ask, you might not get it.
And also on that note, you may say, "Oh, well, I'm staying at the Marriott," right? And people might know that. And this commonly happened when I have some friends or people I met who are visiting China. They're like, "Well, where are you staying?" "Oh, at the Marriott." I'm like, "Yeah, which one?" In Shanghai, there's like 20 Marriotts. And so make sure just rely on the big brand name to get you through. China's a big place. Even the small towns are bigger than many of our large cities. So make sure you not just get the name, but the actual location or the unique name of that brand of hotel.
And then once you're in China, staying at your hotel, then you're probably going to want to take some, walks in the area because, just walks on the street are one of the fun things about being in China. It's super safe at night, and there's lots of food and all kinds of things you can see just walking around. So I like to kind of get familiar with the streets around the hotel, maybe the names. And sometimes you can even ask the hotel staff to help make you a little map. Like you can write the characters with the pinyin on it, and you can get really clear on the area so that you don't get lost. And if you need to ask people, you can find your way back.
Absolutely. In fact, I will touch on something you mentioned there, John, is that, it's safe. Right. I got to say, out of all my years in China, I've walked down the darkest of alleys in the middle of the night and never felt, unsafe, if you will. It's a very safe, and people don't really, you especially as a foreigner there, you're even a little 2 degrees safer, at least from physical harm, right?
Yeah, and a lot of people are still wearing masks, so you're safe in that way too if you're concerned.
But I love the point here of just walking around and getting to know things. If you pay attention to most of the street signs in China, obviously there's Chinese characters on them. In some of the larger cities like Shanghai, you'll have pinyin on as well. Some of the smaller cities don't have that. So, making sure you learn your characters is really important. But a lot of the street signs also will have a designation whether that street is, on the street sign, it'll point, hey, this is north, this is south, which is really handy. So north, south, east, west, obviously. So you can get your bearings a little bit.
Yeah, I do like that.
But when it comes to also having maps in China, do not try to rely on something like Google Maps in China. Google Maps does not work well in China even if you have a VPN, it doesn't work so well. So I recommend Baidu Maps. That's an excellent app. You don't even have to have the app. You can use the website, but obviously the app's a little better on your phone if you're going to be there. So yeah, having something like that is going to be really helpful. You can put in the characters. It has pretty much all the locations there. But also something that's helpful with Baidu Maps is that the satellite images are accurate. Google's some sort of I don't know, it's some sort of an implicit agreement or something that their satellite images are not totally aligned with the actual map. It's offset. By, I don't know, what is it, John? It's like 100 something meters. I don't know.
Yeah, it's super annoying.
Yeah, it is. It's some disagreement over, spying on locations in China. So to get around whatever they say, okay, well, we do this for China, so it makes it hard to, But anyway, it does make it hard. So make sure you get something like Baidu Maps, and you'll be able to punch in characters or whatever and be able to find your location.
But Apple Maps works pretty well, just not Google Maps.
Oh, does it?
Okay, so next up is sightseeing. So obviously you're in China, you're going to go see some sights. I feel like Beijing is probably the place with the most things to see in the area. But again, this is one of those things where if you do a little homework, write down the Chinese names of the places you want to see, then you can actually have much better conversations, communicate much better about where you're going. Just everything is easier. And actually one way to do it that I've discovered recently is just using like Chat GPT. Like put in I want to go see the most famous sites in Beijing. What are they? Give me the Chinese with pinyin. And it's pretty useful.
Another workaround that I've used before is if it's obviously a site, if it's even semi-famous or something, you can put it into Wikipedia. And in Wikipedia, oftentimes it will show you that Chinese characters. And if you need a little more, or it doesn't have the Chinese characters for whatever reason, you can just go and select the Chinese version of that article, and then boom, it'll spit out the title or the location in like the longer Chinese name.
Yeah, and you can probably just start by putting in the Chinese city name in Wikipedia and then finding the links.
And there are many resources out there. There's a whole bunch of websites, travel websites, and books. Lonely Planet has been one that's been popular for many years. So there are a lot of great resources out there online to find these locations and find where you want to go. But like I said earlier, do be wary of resources, sites, guides that do not include the actual address or the name of the location in Chinese. An example is like TripAdvisor. There are some resources on there where you can click through and go here and here to try to get an address or something in Chinese, but like right on the site, no, it doesn't have it in Chinese. And you got to be a little careful sometimes about trying to make sure you feel like you can access everything in China. There is the Great Firewall, and there are a lot of things that are blocked or for whatever reason just run a lot slower in China. So you need to make sure that you're not solely relying upon just the instant accessibility of all websites that you're used to accessing.
Okay, and one other little warning related to sightseeing. In China, there are two very well-known scams, especially in Shanghai and Beijing, which are the tea house or massage scam and the art student scam.
Oh, yeah.
So, you'll be walking in one of the touristy areas of Beijing or Shanghai, and some very friendly people will come up and start chatting with you. They will be happy to speak to you in Chinese if you want to speak in Chinese, or if you don't speak Chinese, they'll speak to you in English, but they have an ulterior motive.
Mm-hmm. They want to lure you into this tea ceremony. Say, hey, come join us, some Chinese tea ceremony, and put you in the room, and they bring out some teas or whatever, and you have a drink, and then they give you a bill, and it's like 2,000 RMB or more.
And if it's the art students, they'll take you to their teacher's studio with all this art by their teacher, but it's actually just prints of well-known Chinese art, and they'll just rip you off. So just be careful of those. Most people are super friendly. You don't need to worry that much about scams, but these scams are very well known. I know so many people who have gotten ripped off by them, and I always feel like if I forget to warn them, they'll get scammed that very day, and then I'll remember the next day and they just got scammed. It's so annoying.
I think it's just one of these things. Be wary. If someone's nice and friendly to you, that's great. I gotta say, in China, if they're just kind of out of the blue and speaking English with me, really nice, that is a little bit of a red flag. I've met some people that they didn't have an ulterior motive other than they just wanted to meet you and practice their English. But if they want to take you somewhere, oh, come here, come try this, be careful. Just
yeah, Jared, this one time I was on a bus in China and this foreigner was being really friendly to me. It was so shady.
I know. That guy's totally sketch, right? Wait a second.
All right, but about sightseeing, one other thing. Like, I know that some of you are a little bit introverted like me. You're not super, outgoing, practicing Chinese with everyone you see. But try not to be like head down, going to your site to go sightseeing and not talking to people. Like, if you can, try to tell some people, oh, I'm going to the Great Wall today. And, whether it's the people at your hotel or the guy who's selling you your breakfast or whatever, and you'll actually get into some really nice chats. If you can just share a little bit about what you're doing, people will be super friendly, and you'll get some great conversation practice at whatever level you're at.
And the great thing is that if you are going to tourist locations in China, recognize that these are tourist locations for Chinese people as well. And there's this fun dynamic, okay? John, you and I, you're in Shanghai, lived there as well many years, and, you're just going about your daily life there in Shanghai. Most people, okay, you're a foreigner, they might glance at you, whatever. You get over it pretty fast. But when you go to a tourist location, it's different because, Shanghai people, they're used to seeing foreigners. And people in big cities, they see foreigners all the time. But these tourist locations, they're coming from smaller towns and perhaps villages. And this might be their first time visiting the big city of Shanghai from from wherever they're at. And so for them to see a foreigner, it's like, whoa, I've heard there's foreigners in Shanghai, and here's one, so you get a lot more looks and stares, if you will. But like you're mentioning, John, this is an opportunity for you to connect with people. So if you're traveling anywhere around China, and this is actually, if you are going even to a small town, you're going to get more of that. But people are going to find you curious. They're curious about you, and so that is an opportunity to use your Chinese and to connect, and to sometimes, step a little outside of yourself. Recognize that maybe they're asking a lot of questions or they're staring, whatever. It's just because they've never seen someone like you before.
And this brings us to my final point, which is, remember that good old self-introduction that you learned when you very first started studying Chinese? Well, it's time to pull it out, dust it off, practice it a little bit, because it's probably going to come in very handy. And if your Chinese is no longer, beginner, and you haven't been introducing yourself much lately, then it's definitely worth practicing and making sure you know how to say, the job you do, stuff like that, because you're going to use it. People are going to ask you about this all the time, and you want to be prepared for that too.
So get ready to tell them where you're from, what country. Don't worry about the city, because it's they'll have no idea, really. Usually have no idea. You could say I'm from the east or the west of the country, whatever. But tell them, hey, your marital status. It may not be common, or you may feel that's a little disrespectful. Sometimes people asking that, but get ready to talk about it. Talk about your family, what your job is, and if also how much money you make, because they're going to ask that too.
You don't have to talk about that, but they'll want to talk to you about kids, I'm sure, if you have kids.
And a strange question, well, I guess outside it always seems strange, but a very common question is if you have kids, they're going to ask you, does your country pay you to have kids?
A very common question, really?
Yeah, I got it. I got it quite frequently. I think it's because there are European countries that will give incentives to have kids, and I guess America does too. The tax system incentivizes, you get discounts on taxes for having kids. So anyway, but there's, that was actually quite a common question I got when people found out I had kids.
Well, that's a situation that's changing rapidly in China. All of a sudden, China wants you to have kids.
That's right.
Oh, and one other thing that I've noticed is a very hot topic, this past month especially, is ChatGPT, which in Chinese is ChatGPT. I've had taxi drivers bring it up to me.
Really?
Yeah, everyone's talking about it. It's quite interesting, and the Chinese are really captivated by it.
But I think overall, just be ready and prepared to just talk about your life, things you're interested in, family, whatever it is, just this daily life, as if you were introducing yourself or just getting to know somebody, because you are in Chinese. And it's a great opportunity to actually start putting that Chinese to work and just, stepping outside of yourself and starting making that more real in your life.
Yeah, and it's hard to believe that after all this time, you can finally go to China again. But yes, you can.
Yes, and you can learn Chinese and go to China too.
Come on down.
All right, now it's time for a word from our sponsor. And today our sponsor is
Mandarin Companion, Chinese graded readers.
Today we're talking about Sherlock Holmes and the case of the curly-haired company. It's an adaptation of Arthur Conan Doyle's Sherlock Holmes story, Sherlock Holmes in the case of the Red-Headed League.
The red-headed part doesn't work so well in China, so that's why we have our curly-haired company story. But, the whole story has been adapted to a Chinese context. It is level 1. You can read it. It's the story, the mystery that you love, but it's all Chinese.
And a lot of people say that this is the best Sherlock Holmes mystery. We had a lot of fun adapting this one, and you're right. It says that red-headed people don't really have those in China. But curly-haired people are just about as uncommon as red-headed people are in the West, unless maybe you live in Ireland or something. But so it was a good transition, a good conversion of the whole story into China. So it is Manor Companion, Sherlock Holmes in the case of the curly-haired company. It's a level 1 graded reader using only 300 basic characters. You can go out and get it today on Amazon, iBooks, COVA, or wherever you get your books. Check it out. Now we have a listener question, and this comes from Erica from Utah. Here's what she writes. She says, I did have a question. My husband, daughter, and myself are able to speak Chinese to a certain extent. We're L2 learners, and our Chinese is heavily influenced by Taiwanese Mandarin. Will focusing on one accent or dialect affect how we will be understood by other native speakers? Will our tones be considered correct in Taiwan but incorrect in Beijing? Thanks, Erica. P.S. My husband gave me your 跟我说中文 t-shirt for my birthday, and I absolutely love it, but I haven't been brave enough to wear it in Chinatown. All right, well, Erica from Utah, which, hey, that's where I'm at, so maybe we'll run into each other. Who knows? This is a good question.
Yeah, so the key here is Taiwanese Mandarin. So as long as it's Mandarin, it's fine. It's going to get across. Taiwanese do have a distinctive accent, which people in Beijing will recognize immediately, and it's very different from their accent, but it's still all Mandarin. So there are other languages spoken in Taiwan, so as long as it's Mandarin, you should be fine.
Yeah, and I wouldn't really say that, I do know in some Taiwanese they may have a little different tone for some words, and might be just sometimes there definitely is a Taiwanese accent, but that is not unique to Taiwan, right? There's many different regional accents throughout China, and I think a truth that I learned over a number of years is that really, like, everyone has an accent. And so, in America, we often equate fluency in English with having, like, not having an accent, or having, kind of non-accented English. But that's not really true. You can have an accent and still be quite fluent in English. And so in Chinese, everyone has not everyone, but almost everyone has some sort of regional accent. And it's okay. It's more important, I think, maybe about having your tones, right? And just being able to string together an actual sentences and conversation in Chinese.
But just to give an example of how the tones might be different, in Taiwan, they are least likely to use the neutral tone, and in Beijing, they are most likely to use it, and then Shanghai is kind of in the middle. So it's not a huge difference, but there is a difference, and communication is still fine.
So there you go, Erica. You and your family, you're going to be A-OK when you come to visit China. All right, now it's time for rants and raves. John, what do you have for us today? Do you have a rant or do you have a rave?
Well, I have sort of a strange rave because, our topic today is traveling to China. And I was just thinking about how travel has changed over the years. And one thing that's super useful if you are learning Chinese and you're in China is just having your phone with the camera. And of course, you're going to be taking pictures on any trip. But what I would say will make your trip much more meaningful for a long time is to take tons of pictures of like signs and stuff, menus, like written Chinese that you see, because that's stuff that you can be studying for years to come if you want to, right? I've taken tons of pictures of, signs, ads, all kinds of things around town, like for my blog, Sinosplice, over the years. But I know a lot of people have had, great experiences at restaurants. Well, take a picture of the whole menu, take a picture of the dish, take a picture of the name on the menu, like go crazy with your phone, and then allow that to help you continue to study Chinese after you leave China because you had that personal connection with those places, those dishes, and if you don't take the picture, it's just going to be a memory that could fade.
Well said, John. I on that also chime in. Google and Playco have optical readers too. You can point your camera at it, and yeah, you can usually recognize the characters, which is pretty slick. So you could put those in a flashcard or something, right?
Okay, so Jared, rant or rave?
Okay, John. Today I have a rave, but there's also a dual side of it, of a rant too. Okay, my rave is we're talking about addresses in Chinese. I love how addresses are formatted and organized in Chinese. It makes so much sense. Like, okay, what you first do, let's just, on very high level, it always works from like larger to smaller. So you'll start with like the country. Then the next thing is like, the province. Then you might have the county. Then you'll have the city. Then you'll have the district. And then you'll have the street. And then you'll have the number of the building. And then you'll have the apartment. And they might have the sub-apartment. So it like all makes sense. Like it goes from large to small, which is, and my rant on the other side of that is how addresses are not formatted like that in English and many other languages, which makes for things very confusing. Like in English, we have like, okay, the street number, and then the name, the number of the building, then the name of the street, and then you go the city, and then the state and the country, then a postcode, and it's just like, and when people try to translate like addresses from Chinese to English, they get all messed up, and I've spent uncountless hours dealing with bad addresses because when I had my bakery, Cineswirl there in Shanghai, I had to deal with deliveries, and we'd have a lot of foreign clients living all around Shanghai, and get these addresses. They're just an utter mess, and I'm like, just send it to me in Chinese. It's a lot better. So anyway, that's my rave. I love Chinese addresses and how they're formatted. So easy to understand.
I'm also a fan of the big to small. It's great for dates too. One other thing about the dates, when you start with the year and then the month and then the day, if you use that for like file names or directory names or whatever, then they self sort. Same is true for locations as well. But sociologists will tell you this is because China has a collectivist society, so you start with the group and then the individual is last, whereas in the U.S. we have this individualist society where the individual comes first and then the unit comes last.
Yeah, that's what I definitely bet that's what people were thinking of when they decided how to format addresses.
They were.
So my name is Sophia.
Sophia Xavier and I met during my time in China, and we reconnected recently.
I am originally from Portugal. I started my professional career as a translator and interpreter of Chinese Portuguese, and eventually my career evolved into soft skills. Currently, I'm a life coach. I work with NLP, hypnosis. I've also wrote a book recently that kind of bridges these two worlds that I have. So Chinese language on one side and the subconscious mind and soft skills coaching on the other side.
In a short time with Sophia, you can quickly recognize her enthusiasm and adventurous spirit. Her path is unique, but also quite relatable as she overcame her own challenges and rose above the perceptions of those around her. Stay with us. All right, Sophia, why did you start learning Chinese?
I think I started out of curiosity in the very beginning. Of course, eventually this grew into something bigger, and I really fell in love with China and the Chinese language. But in the very beginning, it was just a pure curiosity. I was always very, fascinated about Asia in general as a continent. I think in the West, we have all these narratives about Asia, about China, right? And I think in our subconscious mind, it's like as if Asia is just this mystical, exotic continent, far away, in a way hard to understand. And I think that applies a lot to China and Chinese language. That got me interested because I didn't know a lot about Asia, and I knew that people in the West, or at least in my country, in Portugal, didn't really know what was going on in Asia. And I always had this explorer mindset. So I really wanted to know by myself what was going on in Asia. And so that led me to pursue a bachelor's degree in Asian studies back in 2015. And then eventually, after a year of that program, I thought it was just too broad and too big, because imagine studying Asia. It's such a big thing, right? To try to master in a 3-year bachelor's program. So then I had a friend who happened to be in Macau at that time, and she knew about this program, which was a cooperation between a Portuguese university and Macau Polytechnic University and Beijing Language and Culture University. And that program basically included 2 years of an exchange program. And so I thought it was really interesting. I would get to learn Chinese. I would really get to focus on a skill, a skill that I could eventually use on a professional level. And I would get the chance to do an exchange program in Macau and Beijing, which I knew would be great for me, and it was totally funded. There was a scholarship and so on.
Wow.
I just thought, okay, it's a no-brainer. I'm just going to go ahead and do it. So I did the transition from Asian studies to Chinese-Portuguese translation and interpretation. So I started learning Chinese when I was in Lisbon, studying Asian studies. But then eventually I had the chance to focus on Chinese language.
So I've got a whole bunch of questions here just spinning around my head. I got to know. So a couple things. One, right now we're speaking English. Your native tongue is Portuguese, right?
Yeah, that's right.
So you had to have learned English along the line here. So I got to hear about this. I'm also curious to know about what it was like learning Chinese for a native Portuguese speaker, and what was that like, and what materials are available for learners there?
Yeah, so all the materials are pretty much in English. You don't get to have a lot of materials in Portuguese. And I personally feel that learning materials, even in English, they don't usually teach you necessarily what you need to learn. So when I first started out, I think the materials were pretty bad, and they were all in English.
How was your English at that time? Did you grow up speaking English?
Well, I started learning English pretty young, but of course, in Portugal, you get to speak Portuguese every day. You don't really get to speak English that much. And it's funny because I think I started speaking English a lot more when I came to China, especially when I started working in China.
So you moved to China to improve your English.
Exactly. But in the very beginning, especially as a student, intentionally or not, I started speaking Chinese. When I moved to Beijing the first year, I came with my class. So all the Portuguese classmates came from Portugal to Beijing that year. And then when we arrived in Beijing Language and Culture University, we had to do an exam, and they placed us in different levels. So according to your Chinese level, you got to be placed in a different level, like, Chuji, Zhongji, Gaoji, and so on. Mm-hmm. I got placed in an intermediate high level, and I got separated from the whole class. And back then it was like, I'm getting out of my comfort zone. I'm getting out of that bubble, because most of my classmates had the chance to be together basically in similar levels or in the same class, but I was in a different class. So I got to get along with a lot of other people from all around the world, because in Beijing Language and Culture University, you have more than 100 nationalities represented. And for some reason, I started getting along mainly with Asians, with people that didn't speak English that well. Mm-hmm. So it was mainly people from Japan, Korea, the Philippines, even North Koreans. I had 2 North Koreans in my class.
Oh, wow, yeah.
So they couldn't speak English, basically, most of them. And their default language in China was Chinese. So for some of them, they had Chinese roots. They used to speak Chinese at home with their parents and so on. So they were there to improve their Chinese skills, but they already could speak quite well Chinese. And then for others, they were in China already for quite a long time. Some of them were just studying, to Some to improve, others just really to spend some time and,
Have a little
yeah,
fun in
right.
China, right?
Right. So I got to speak a lot of Chinese with them. And even though I wasn't getting along with a lot of Chinese people in that very first stage, but it was great because if you speak to a native speaker right away, you feel a lot of pressure, right? For me, speaking to those classmates, which were also not native but had a much better Chinese level than me, it was like a bridge, in between the level that I had and eventually being fluent.
So you're describing kind of that atmosphere, and I get it. Chinese was the common language, so you definitely had a lot of opportunities to use it there, even if it wasn't with native speakers, but that's fantastic. Practice and opportunities. We talked a little bit before we started recording here about you were 19 when you moved here to China.
Right.
I gather you're quite the adventurous person. Right now you're in Cambodia while we're talking,
Yeah.
so you're kind of, I guess, a nomad, right?
Right.
But what was that experience like moving to China, being away from your family, friends, and things like that at a younger age?
Yeah, so first of all, it's what you said. I was always quite adventurous and I always felt very comfortable being on my own. Even nowadays, I love solo traveling. So that was a part of me that was already very strong at that age. For my family at that time, of course, they were worried about me. And it was just, we are happy that you are chasing your dreams and so on. But at the same time, we don't know nothing about China, especially on the ground. We don't know how things really are there. So for them, it was a little bit more difficult, but I was really happy that they supported me, even though they didn't necessarily understand my decision back then. And moving to China when I was just 19 really shaped my personality in a lot of ways. A lot of my adult personality was shaped in China. I received a lot of influence in this country, right? I mean, you are influenced by your environment. So I definitely feel that a lot of me was built in China, let's say, because those were quite formative years, right?
Yeah, I get that. I also want to hear about kind of your perspective. You said you had a lot of opportunities to use Chinese, and getting immersion into the language is great if you can get it, right?
Yeah.
Maybe you could contrast your interaction with your classmates and how you had opportunities to speak Chinese with what your experience was like in the classroom. Because I've also heard a lot of mixed stories and experiences with studying Chinese at a university in China. So maybe you could share with us a little bit about your perspective on that.
So there are definitely pros and cons, right, about studying Chinese in China, and especially in a new university. It was an intensive program, right? In Beijing, for example, it was a full year of just Chinese language. But of course, you study with other foreigners. Of course, because you are studying language, right? So you get to have classmates that are also doing the same. They are usually foreigners. But even when I was studying Chinese business, it was like 1 year program about Chinese business and economy, basically economics. Even then, I was in a class with foreigners, even though what I really wanted was to study with Chinese people. But even though I was studying with other foreigner classmates, which for me, it wasn't the ideal situation, I felt that it was a lot better than what I was having in Portugal. Because in Portugal, apart from my Chinese teacher who couldn't even speak Portuguese or English, he could only speak Chinese. Apart from him, everyone else around me speaks Portuguese. So I didn't really have that many chances to practice Chinese outside of the classroom. I think learning in a classroom in China, in a university, has a lot of pros. And I loved studying in Beijing Language and Culture University. I have to say, they're very structured, very organized. Their curriculum makes a lot of sense. You get to choose a lot of different subjects. You don't really just study Chinese language, but everything eventually makes sense. And so my experience there was very, very positive. But overall, I would say that learning Chinese in an university is probably not the most effective way of learning Chinese. When you are in an university, you follow their structure, but that is not necessarily what works for you. I was always a very independent learner. The moments that I loved the most was when I had time to study by myself.
Mm.
Those moments I felt that was when I was really expanding a lot and I could learn Chinese on my own terms, right?
Mm-hmm.
The name of the book is Chinese on Your Terms, because I believe that if you design the language learning journey to yourself, specifically to your needs, it's going to be a lot more effective. Of course, there are other aspects that are very positive about studying in a university. For example, the accountability,
Yeah.
right? Because university provides you with accountability, with a structured curriculum. You have classmates that are ideally at least like-minded people that also want to study Chinese. So all of that helps to keep you motivated. But if you already have that intrinsic motivation, I think you can easily also find your own way. And I know people who have learned Chinese all by themselves.
Well, I'm curious to know, what was that motivation that was continuing to push you along to continue to learn the language? I mean, yeah, it's a little easier when you're in China, but there's those hard times, right? And there's difficulties, and am I ever going to get this language? You know, those type of feelings. What kind of carried you through some of those harder times?
Yeah, I would say that mindset played a very important role here, because I always valued soft skills a lot. And now looking back, I think that was really what made me go through some obstacles and some moments where I really felt maybe this is just not for me. I personally had a lot of people projecting a lot of limiting beliefs into me. So their limited visions, they would project those ideas into me. And even teachers, I had teachers who thought that learning Chinese was hard. So that is already a very limiting thing, right? I remember my first Chinese teacher. The first thing that she said in class was, Chinese is a really hard language. You will need at least 10 years of hard work to be able to speak Chinese. And of course, those kinds of words are extremely shocking when you are starting out your journey, because it's someone with authority in the field. You are starting your classes, it's your very beginning. Subconsciously, you already think that Chinese is hard, because I think the whole world thinks that Chinese is hard. For the book Chinese on Your Terms, we did research on the idioms that exist across the world that mean that something is incomprehensible. And there are just so many idioms that use the word Chinese or Chinese language to express that idea of something being incomprehensible or hard to understand. For example, in Portuguese language, if we want to say that something is incomprehensible or I don't understand what you are saying, I just say, are you speaking Chinese? Can you stop speaking in Chinese? Back then I thought, okay, this is the thing that we say in Portuguese language. But then I realized it's not in Portuguese language only. It's all over the world in so many different languages.
Wow.
And even the Japanese, that I wouldn't expect, they have an idiom that they are imitating the way Chinese people speak.
Really?
And also to express that idea of being incomprehensible, hard to understand.
Wow. I had no idea.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Is Chinese hard? Yeah, I would say, it's a challenge that's unique than perhaps other languages, right? And also part of that is, what is your native tongue, right? If you are a Japanese speaker, you're going to have a leg up, right?
Right.
You're going to have at least some characters under your belt and be familiar with that. But that's actually a really good point, that it's as hard as you want it to be, right?
Yeah, and if you, in your subconscious mind, learning Chinese is already hard, it's going to be hard.
Mm-hmm.
Because you have a program in your mind already telling you Chinese is hard. So you will look for ways to prove that your mind is right. So I think as a collective, we are programmed to believe that learning Chinese is very hard. When we first get to a Chinese class, let's say, and the teacher just keeps reinforcing that idea that learning Chinese is hard, in your mind, learning Chinese is just getting harder and harder. And what kind of results will you have if you believe that learning Chinese is hard?
This brings to mind something that I used to say back when I was in China. I was involved in a lot of business in China, and sometimes when people were talking about something they wanted to get into, or a business area or something licensing, they would say sometimes, it could be really hard to get the license to do this type of business in China. And I would say, but you can do it. Hard or not, it can be done. So it's kind of like, all right, hard or not, it can be done, right? You can learn Chinese.
I love that. And I was about to tell you that. I love the name of the podcast, You Can Learn Chinese. It's such a good program, to install on someone's mind because you can learn Chinese. I love that. Because believing that is possible, it's so crucial to keep you motivated. I think having that vision of it's possible, maybe I'm planting the seeds right now, I'm watering them, and I still cannot see any results right now because everything is under the soil. But eventually, in the right season, I'm sure I'm going to have the results. Sometimes you got to believe in the invisible in order to keep moving forward.
That's a great analogy, I think, of a seed. You take an apple seed, you put it in the ground, you give it the right amount of water and sun and fertilizer, you just take care of it the way it should be. It can't help but grow up into an apple tree. It will. If you take care of it and you do all things right, it will. And you don't even have to do everything right. I feel bad about this sometimes. I used to think, maybe 10 years ago, like, this is the way you have to learn, right? And I've come to learn that there's a lot of ways to learn a language, and they all can work, but some are more effective than others.
Yeah. And something that I find very important is being flexible and being able to adjust as you go. Because when you start out, you think learning Chinese is this way and this way. But eventually you learn that it can be this way and this way. And it's always changing, but being flexible, it's really important. Again, a metaphor, right? The bridges, they also shake a little bit or they have that vibration that helps them to be stable, right? They cannot be just rigid.
Mm-hmm.
Otherwise they would break. And it's the same in learning Chinese. You need to be flexible. I remember times when I would feel really demotivated or I felt like, well, maybe they are all right and this is just not for me, and then you have that inner dialogues as well, kind of, doubting yourself.
Mm-hmm.
When you don't feel motivated, take a break. It's okay. You don't need to quit. You can just take a break and then, after a month or two, you go back and you keep learning Chinese.
I'm sensing there might be some story there.
Yeah, I have plenty of them, but I already told you about my first Chinese teacher, right?
Yeah.
But that was not the only case. I came across so many Chinese teachers that thought learning Chinese was hard and that learning Chinese was a slow process. It takes you 10, 15, 20 years, a lifetime to learn Chinese. Sometimes when it gets hard, you kind of go back to those thoughts, right? And your mind tricks you a little bit.
Yeah.
But I remember when I was still in high school, and it was towards the end of high school, and my teacher was asking the class, so what do you want to major in? And back then, I already knew I wanted to pursue Asian studies. But I didn't have a very clear career path in mind. All of my classmates answered, I want to pursue a career in law, in finances, in medicine, in engineering, so on. All the kinds of answers that people would expect you to say, right? And then I came with, I would like to do Asian studies. It just sounds really interesting. And I was always very spontaneous and intuitive about my decision, so I didn't have a very logical reason to do that. And so I remember when I said that, people were like, Asian studies, Chinese, China. They just found it very ridiculous in a way. They couldn't really get my vision. And at that time, I wasn't that sure why I would want to pursue this. So when you are in those moments, yourself, you are still not completely sure of the why. And there's someone who is kind of doubting. That can shake a little bit your confidence. And I remember I was already studying in Beijing, and I went back to Portugal and I went to see the doctor. And the doctor, he was like, you are learning Chinese, very interesting. But you will never learn to write Chinese. That's impossible. No foreigner can learn to write Chinese. I believe that you can probably speak a little bit, that's okay. But learning to write, that's impossible. And then he tested me. So he said, can you write Macau in Chinese? He just suddenly tested me. And I thought that was just so disrespectful. I don't have to prove anything to you, you know. These are just some small examples, but they reflect that people in general don't believe that learning Chinese is possible. And they will keep making you feel that you are not capable of, or it's not possible to learn Chinese. And that can be a little demotivating along the way.
Yeah, I recall when I first moved to China, at that time, Chinese, it seemed like this insurmountable language, right? But there comes to that point where, it's just Chinese. It's just a language, right? And yeah, they're speaking Chinese and I'll speak to them and we're going to communicate or whatever, right? And then I'll switch to English and it's just the way it is. It's like a normal thing. And at that point, you're kind of like, what was I all worried about?
And something important here is Chinese people believe that Chinese is hard.
Yeah.
They acknowledge that. It's not that the rest of the world thinks that Chinese is hard. If you speak Chinese, they would be, wow, you can speak Chinese. Wow, 你的中文真好. Right?
Well, that's never happened to me at all. I'm just kidding. Yeah. All the time, right?
Right. And that is also very interesting, right? Because, again, that just keeps reinforcing the same idea. But I think for your mind, there's no such a thing as hard or easy. Your subconscious mind will learn anything that you want it to learn, but you need to frame it the right way. Because it's all about the framing, really. If you think that learning Chinese is boring, is hard, is difficult, takes time, look, these are all programs around learning Chinese. But how about framing it in another way? Learning Chinese is fun. Learning Chinese is adventure. Learning Chinese is interesting. It's quick. You can add a lot of things around and it will have a completely different result on your learning language.
That sounds like a wonderful way to approach the language. And probably not just Chinese, but really, I guess, even anything you're learning, right? Well, Sophia, something I'm also interested to hear about is what kind of opportunities did this open up to you? Okay, you're still traveling around Asia. I know COVID has had a big impact on everyone who's been connected with China, but maybe you could talk about that. It's like, what type of things were you able to do where you wouldn't have been able to otherwise?
So many. Of course, on a professional level, I think it was just so intense because learning Chinese really gave me the opportunity to explore so many different skills that I have. I got to be the Portuguese private teacher of Jackie Chan.
Oh, wow. How did that come about? That sounds like a pretty interesting story.
That was very unexpected, actually. I had this friend one day contacted me and asked me, so Sophia, do you have time this weekend to come over and teach Portuguese classes? And I was like, oh, you know that I work on weekends, so of course I don't have time. You already know that. Why are you even asking me? And so basically my reaction was like, just shut up. And then the next moment, he was like, are you sure? Because it's Jackie Chan. And at that moment, I was like, what? Really? Of course I do have time. And then I kind of had to readjust and rearrange my weekend work to be able to make it. And then for about a week, I was exchanging audios and virtual classes with Jackie Chan. I mean, not directly with him, but with his producer. Basically, after that, I got to meet him in person and had some one-on-one private lessons while he was shooting a commercial.
That sounds really neat. But why was he learning Portuguese? I assume it was for a commercial or movie, right?
Precisely, yeah. It was for a commercial that was for Brazil. The thing is, I speak European Portuguese. Of course, I'm quite familiar with Brazilian Portuguese. Back then, it was also kind of a challenge because I was like, oh my God, I speak European Portuguese and now I need to teach Brazilian Portuguese to Jackie Chan. That's such a big responsibility. But it went very, very successfully and the commercial was a success in Brazil. Like it was, viral on YouTube and other social media.
Wow, that's fantastic. That's a neat opportunity. So there you go. Learn Chinese and maybe you'll be able to teach a celebrity your language, right?
And it's not even about sometimes the opportunity itself, but the way you create trust with Chinese people. You really do that through Chinese language. Chinese language helps a lot to create that trust. to create much more intimate relationships, to be able to understand Chinese people a lot better, and to be able to break the ice a lot quicker. I love solo traveling. And one of the things that really helped me to improve my Chinese skills was traveling around all China. And especially, these 3 years, because of COVID and everything, I didn't get to go outside for 3 years.
Yeah.
So you can imagine I had all this time to travel around China and explore different places. And I just love, getting to a rural area in, let's say, Guizhou or any province, and I feel that I can instantly break the ice. And that helps so much because wherever I go, people ask me, do you travel solo? And I say, never alone. It's not that I am alone. I find amazing people wherever I go. And especially in China, I felt that I would get the chance to meet more people because people would just approach you and I would be more open to meet them and they would also be more open to interact with me.
Well, Sophia, looking back on your experience here, when you started learning Chinese till now, if you could go back and change any part of that journey, what would you do differently and why?
So I would definitely be more open to receive feedback, which I usually wasn't. Not only open to receive feedback, but also actively asking for feedback. I think feedback really is very powerful and can help you to grow a lot. But we need to let go of the ego and the idea that we need to be perfect and that we cannot make mistakes. So I would just go ahead and make more mistakes and make a fool of myself and be ridiculous. And I would tell my past self, just don't care about those mistakes or just feel free to be ridiculous. That's okay. That's part of the process. That would be the first thing. Then second, finding a mentor, finding someone that has already been through the process. The initial idea of Chinese on Your Terms, it was like a guide on how to learn Chinese. Because, a lot of materials focus on the what to learn. You learn grammar, you have books about grammar, about listening, comprehension, and so on. But I feel that there's not a lot of materials about how to learn Chinese and how to do it effectively, how to do it, faster. What are the right tools? All of that, I feel that there's a gap there. And that's why so many learners sometimes feel a bit lost on the way. So if I could speak to myself in the past, I would say, just go and find a mentor, find someone that can guide you along the way.
Well, that's great. And I think overall, just on that note of there are a lot of dearth of resources there on how to learn a language. That's what this podcast is all about.
Yeah.
There's so many different aspects that we can look at about learning a language. Well, Sophia, I really appreciate you taking the time to share this perspective with us. And if people want to find out a little bit more about you, and specifically if they want to check out your book, where can they go to find that?
So Chinese on Your Terms is now available on Amazon. You have the ebook available on Amazon. We are working on publishing it in China. It's something that it's still being worked on. You can also contact me through LinkedIn and we can support you on that, also to provide a physical paperback version of the book.
Well, we'll go ahead and put a link to that book in the show notes. So if anyone wants to check that out, you'll know where to find it.
Thank you so much.
Sophia, thank you so much for this time. And I really enjoyed our discussion in this chat. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Jared. Thank you. And keep up the great work here. You can learn Chinese. And I think that's such a powerful message.
You have been listening to the You Can Learn Chinese podcast. Help us spread the word by sharing this with your friends, classmates, teachers, cousins, banker, reader, learner, historian, lifter, equestrian, and that one guy named Ryan. You can subscribe on iTunes or wherever you get your podcasts. And please write us a review so we know how we're doing. You can find us on Facebook and at MannerCompanion.com. Or tag us on social media, #MannerCompanion. Apologies to John Cena, we just ran out of time. You Can Learn Chinese podcast is produced by myself, Jared Turner, and our editor is Kaiser Kuo, and interview editor is Dominic Edgley. I'd like to thank our special guest, Sophia Xavier, and of course, thanks to my co-host, the man, the myth, the legend, John Paston. See you next time.